Good morning. I think we're going to start. All right, I think we're going to start. Thank you. So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the most French accented panel you're going to see at JP Morgan, probably. The first announcement I'm going to make is that, unfortunately, we just learned that Emmanuel Macron will not be able to join us this morning. He's still addressing questions, as I understand, before the French Assembly. I'm pretty sure he'd rather be with us, but such is the life of French ministers, I guess. So, you know, this being said, we have a fantastic panel this morning, so we'll start with the panel directly. The theme for today is the therapeutic-digital convergence, its impact on the future of medicine, and its implication for the healthcare ecosystem. It's a broad topic, very current, broad. Let me quickly introduce the panelists and myself. I think you have, by the way, a leaflet with the detailed profile, so I'll be short on introductions. My name is Olivier Leclerc, and I'm a senior partner with McKinsey. I'm based in Southern California. With us, we have four panelists. The first one is Rick Valencia, on my right, who is Senior Vice President and General Manager of Qualcomm Life. We'll talk a little bit more about what Qualcomm Life is going forward. Then we have, next is François Nicolas, who is the Vice President of Integrated Care for Sanofi. It's based in Paris, I believe. The next one is Pierre Leurent, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Voluntis, a company based in France. He will talk to us a bit more about what Voluntis is and does. And then finally, we have Philippe Chambon, who is the Managing Director and founder of New Leaf Venture Partners. Right? And has been in the industry for years and years, actually, and investor, actually, in this industry for a while. So let me start with a question for Philippe. Philippe, you have the privilege of being at the cutting edge of innovation in biotech and digital. There seems to be an explosion of innovation in both areas. What are the factors at play in your view?
So the first test is to figure out if this works.
I think it works.
Yes.
It does.
Okay. Good morning. Thanks for having me here. It's great. I think what's fascinating for us on the investment side is the next 10 to 20 years are really going to fundamentally change the way we deliver healthcare across the globe, starting with the US, because that's where I spend most of my time. But if you think about it, we are sitting at the beginning of three massive revolutions. The first one is the explosion of biology knowledge, and we see the first outcome of that in the cancer field, for example, where we have the application of CAR T-cell type of technology, CRISP, of course, which is in the newspaper every day, it seems, and all the progress that we're seeing, broadly speaking, in immune oncology. But all those biology progress are also starting to happen in the CNS field. So we're going to be able to translate that into drugs that are going to change the way we treat disease over the next 10 to 20 years. That's the first revolution. The second one is finally information technology is coming to healthcare, which is great because now we can manipulate massive amount of data on a real-time basis, which will lead or is already leading to applications that enable physicians to make decisions with much more contextual information at the point of care, and also will enable patients to have digital solution tied to drugs that will enable remote monitoring of those patients, much better preventive or preemptive medicine over time that will avoid rehospitalization and so on. So that's the second revolution, which is really this application of everything we're seeing in the information technology world to healthcare. And the third one, which is a kind of a mixed blessing, is really the shifting of cost to the consumer. And that's very important because it's leading to finally consumerism in healthcare and having patients that are starting to behave like purchasers of goods and the understanding they need to have information at their hand to decide what drug they should get at what best price, where, to decide where they should get their knee replaced and so on. And we're seeing emerging business model around that in fact will provide rebate or payment to the patient to get them to make the right choice from an economic as well as from a clinical perspective. So I think those three revolutions are what is going to shape the next 20 years in healthcare.
Okay. So the convergence of these three trends leads to a lot of experimentation,
yes,
and a lot of startups actually sort of springing out everywhere, young sprouts. If you sort of, can you tell us where will digital technologies create the most value in your view?
Well, that's the challenge. We are still early on in that process, so figuring what's going to be the winning solution is something that Pierre will explain to us. But you can think broadly around, I think, three different themes. The first one is the obvious replacement of labor by technology. Those are type of business model that will, in fact, it goes to the pushing more of the cost to the consumer. It's, to put it in almost, in short, it's basically the ATM version of medicine, where you get the patient to use technology to take better care of themselves and eliminate labor costs that way. So those are some of the business model that could be of interest. The second one also is really the rethinking of what drugs are about and tying drugs with digital solutions that enable clearly monitoring and better compliance, but also enable the payer to understand that they are paying for drugs that have true value for them. And if patients are not using the drug appropriately, then stop paying for those drugs. So those are also interesting. So I think the way one has to think about drug pricing is going to evolve over the next 10 years in very significant manner, especially given the noise level that currently exists in the US around the pricing of drugs. And the third one, I forgot what it was.
Never mind. Drug pricing in itself is actually sort of a big topic, but I think as we think about, or sort of as you mentioned, rethinking the way drugs are delivered and provided essentially, and titrated over time, I think, to patients. François, a question for you. Can you tell us how these changes are affecting the strategy of a large pharmaceutical company like Sanofi?
Sure. So first, let me kind of say that Sanofi has seen integrated care as a key building block of its strategy for some time. And then I'll explain, what changes with kind of the convergence or the eruption of digital technologies. But, why integrated care? It's pretty simple. Is if you look at what the patient needs and how the patients can get to good therapeutic results, it's much more than just having good drugs. I mean, what is required is to make sure that the context is taken into account, that patients do adhere to the treatments that they are prescribed, do understand what is required, have the right level of education, coaching, etc. So that's why Sanofi has seen integrated care as a major element of the strategy. Now with the eruption on digital technologies, wearables, the convergence, big data, etc., we had to rethink our strategy. We knew we wanted to go in this kind of direction, but we had to look at the changes and see how do we have to adapt. I would say there are maybe two principal elements. We had to accelerate our involvement there and look at different kinds of partnerships. Traditionally, pharmaceutical companies, know their space, develop internally or externally, but in kind of their own space. Here, to be successful, we realized that we needed to partner with very different kind of entities. And that's what, in the case of Sanofi, led to the partnership with Google Life Sciences, now called Verily. And second, what is also changing is, let's say, the traditional integrated care model was about, let's be patient-centric, let's differentiate our offering, let's have something that payers are going to prefer, or providers, physicians are going to select. So really gain on the market share aspect. What is changing now is the realization that the business models are really dramatically going to change. We don't know yet how, I think it's fair to say, but we do know that they will be different, that on the expectation, the anticipation is that people who will win in the future are those that can deliver patient outcomes, so therapeutic results in real life, as opposed to just in randomized controlled clinical trials. So that is also impacting our strategy, because we are experimenting a number of different business models to see how the field evolves and try to shape it.
Okay, so let's be concrete. I mean, Sanofi is very active in diabetes. I mean, that's one of the biggest franchise. And as you said, you recently announced actually some initiatives in that TA with Google Life Science or Verily. How do you see, so if you take diabetes, how do you see diabetes, for example, diabetes care changing over the next, let's say 5 years, 10 years? What would you say?
Right, so for us, diabetes is kind of a perfect example of where the convergence of digital technologies on healthcare can make a difference. If you look at the disease, I mean, you could say it's quote-unquote simple. We know what to do. What we have to do is to control glucose, or to help patients control their glucose levels. The glucose can be measured, on a daily basis, and there are very effective drugs to manage it. I mean, always newer and better drugs are arriving, but the drugs that are there today are quite effective already. However, even though we know what to do and the drugs are there, the therapeutic results are not there. It's a bit staggering, but about 50% of patients that have diabetes and that are diagnosed are still not controlled for their glucose, which, the glass is half full, so 50% are controlled, but 50% aren't, which is a big deal. So we think that in the future, this can be addressed with digital technologies in 3 ways. One is the wearable technologies, the sensors, will enable patients to have access to real-time data about their own health, and that will give them some feedback about their behavior. So if I'm doing this kind of activity, this is what is the impact, so I can actually improve and learn. So there's this availability of continuous data through wearables. There is the availability of coaching real-time solutions that build on the mobile platforms that patients now have, like every one of us. I mean, not everyone, but this is moving. So the growth in mobile is just extraordinary. So this mobile tool that we use for our lives, our calendar, our banking, our trips, our travel, our accommodations, etc., will also be a medium that is going to be used to provide real-time coaching to patients, and that coaching will be extremely personalized. And the third element is the relationship with the healthcare professionals is going to change. Today, patients see their doctor maybe once a quarter, let's say for 12 minutes. That's not a lot of time to understand their individual situation and what they should do about it. What we see in the future is that the interaction with the healthcare professionals will be much more continuous through remote telemedicine, for example. and much more individualized. So patients will have the support that they need based on their own situation, and that will be enabled by the data that the healthcare professional will receive, not just the data, but the information used on those data. So those really are the three things we see in diabetes care.
Thank you. So essentially you're describing three things: patient monitoring on one hand, behavior modification, so how to modify the patient's behavior, and then telehealth, right, continuous telehealth. Actually, Pierre, this is a question for you. Actually, it seems that Voluntis is at the intersection of all three with the technologies you're trying to develop. So can you tell us more? And I'm interested, actually, we talked about diabetes. Is there any other TA where you see actually sort of this type of technology being applied today?
So a few words about what Voluntis does. So we develop therapeutic companion software. So to go, in addition to drugs, to help patients and healthcare professionals maximize the real-world outcomes of specific therapies. So we provide mobile and cloud-based software which embed algorithms to guide treatment recommendations in real time for people to get, for instance, advice to adjust the dosage of a medication, for instance, or also to help manage side effects of a particular drug. And we enable the patient-physician collaboration remotely, so that's the telehealth component. And these systems are active, so we develop software that are regulated as medical devices because they provide interventions. And so we are at the intersection between digital technologies plus, the medtech field. And we also have biopharmaceutical type of agreements with pharma companies. So we are convinced that in the future, pharma companies will not only provide drugs, but drug plus technology to ensure that the outcomes of a particular treatment are optimized. And they don't have a choice. I think in the future, increasingly payers will demand that. Especially, we talked about the rising price of drugs. There has to be value there, and value needs to be announced by all means. And these digital technologies have a great potential. So diabetes is a great example. Obviously, it's a self-management area by essence. I can give you another example of what we do in other fields, such as oncology, for instance. So we recently announced a groundbreaking partnership with AstraZeneca and the National Cancer Institute. And the idea here is to help drugs that are currently under development and to help patients get instant advice on how to better manage side effects of the treatments. And in this particular case, we work around medication that have some toxicity related to hypertension or diarrhea events. And the good news is that we can positively manage this type of adverse events thanks to such technology. So, for instance, we in terms of data, we collect blood pressure data through automated connection with the blood pressure monitor. We also record the manual entry of diarrhea events. And the algorithms we have in the platform guide instant recommendations on how to adjust the treatment, how to add a new drug, for instance, to help with the GI events. And we also enable a faster response from the healthcare team because the medical centers have instant access to the data, and they can really be more responsive and provide the right care to the right patient at the right time. And I think we see the value proposal here as evolving from the pharma space. And probably in the future, if these trials we are doing are successful, you will see an integrated solution with a pairing of the drug plus its, let's say, a digital companion, and maybe it will be a companion for the whole life cycle for the drug.
And clearly, actually, if you look at oncology, and everybody talks about drugs in oncology, but the reality is that when you actually look at the most cost-effective interventions you can make in oncology, it's actually probably managing side effects and reducing the amount of people going to the ER on a Saturday night because they have issue actually with GI or things like that. So I think in the US you see actually sort of a big trend to payers to try to manage those patients a bit better. So you're really at the heart of it, likely. Before I go into the business models and sort of the implications for some of the and how we capture, actually we create a lot of value, but how do we capture value also in the process? I want to turn to Rick and understand, Rick, you're leading Qualcomm Life Science. Qualcomm, if you ask me, actually is more often associated with telecoms than life science. So
that's fair.
I guess you're trying to change that. Can you tell us a little bit more what you're trying to do at Qualcomm?
We are. So do all of you know who Qualcomm is? Who doesn't know who Qualcomm is? Raise your hand if you've never heard of Qualcomm. This always happens. We're certainly not a brand, and we certainly are not known as a healthcare company, but we operate behind the scenes, and if you own a smartphone, which I'm betting you own a smartphone, even if you don't know who Qualcomm is, or a tablet, you're likely to have some of our technology inside of that. So we are, if we're the, as Intel is inside computers, Qualcomm is inside most of the mobile devices in the world. And about 4 years ago, we launched Qualcomm Life, which is a business focused on enabling the healthcare industry to digitize, basically, and to capture patient data and get it back to the folks who can act on that data. So we launched 4 years ago with a platform that we called TuNet, and TuNet was designed to capture patient vitals in the home, where we work with various device manufacturers to integrate their devices into a gateway device that we built. It's a plug-in device that looks like a nightlight, and we have worked with each of these device manufacturers to make sure that not only will the radio communicate with that device that we've created, but also that they will work interoperably with one another, because they weren't designed, they're made by multiple manufacturers, they weren't designed to work together. But if you're going to provide a remote patient monitoring solution, they need to be able to work together. And for the typical patient that needs to be monitored at home, they're not going to be overly technically sophisticated, so it needs to be very, very simple. So we created that technology. We've been focused on the remote patient monitoring home care market for a while. But through the process, we learned a few things. We're a technology company and a new entrant into healthcare. And we had a thesis around how this market would develop. And we were completely wrong, 100% wrong. And it was mostly around timing. And that's probably not a big surprise for those of you. I'm by the way, a technology entrepreneur prior to starting at Qualcomm. So I had a lot to learn myself, and all of Qualcomm had a lot to learn about the way decisions are made in healthcare and the development cycles in a highly regulated environment where you don't have a simple, in a technology world, you'd have a buyer and a seller. It's pretty straightforward, and the buyer knows what they're paying, the seller knows what they're selling something for. In healthcare, that doesn't exist. So we learned that in that world, things operate very, very differently. And so very recently, we decided to broaden the strategy a bit and really focus less on one environment, which is the home environment, which, by the way, we believe is the next frontier. And I think that's what we heard already here. The fastest growing care setting on earth right now is the home, but it's still going to take a lot of time before it fully develops. So we've made an acquisition a few months ago of a French company by the name of Capsule Technology. And so Capsule does the device integration inside the hospital. And they've got 2,000 hospital customers all over the world. Initially, they were focused in critical care. As we move more and more towards value-based payments and the need to capture data from patients wherever they are, it's more of an enterprise decision to deploy connectivity, not just in critical care, but throughout the whole hospital enterprise and then eventually home. And now we're working to bring those two platforms together so that we can deliver up the data that's going to help to enable the types of solutions that have been talked about here earlier this morning.
So you bring an interesting question, which is where the life cycle question is actually an important question. I mean, you know, life cycle in healthcare. If I think about any pharmaceutical company thinking about 10 years, probably 10 years, 15 years ahead, for the most part, actually, sort of when they look at a development cycle. In tech, you can be obsolete in less than 2 years on any technology. So, I mean, maybe it's a question to both of you. Actually, you're probably at the end of each of the spectrum. So how do you reconcile the two, and how do you manage actually clinical development in a context like this? And I would say the other question is, what do regulators do to adapt to this?
Okay, so I mean, this question, so I'm also coming from the device world, not the tech world, the medical device world. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit slower than the tech world, but still faster than the pharma one. And you know, it's clear that it is a key success factor is to have an organization that has the ability to iterate fast and, you know, do something, deploy it, learn, improve, etc. So and that is 100% not the culture of pharma. So at Sanofi, the way we are approaching it is, let's say, two ways. One is dedicate some teams internally on, let's say, try to protect them because we explained that the environment is different. So there's the internal piece, and then obviously there is the partnering piece, and this is again where like a partnership with a big tech company helps because we expect that culture to come there. In terms of clinical trials, which was in your question as well, so clearly this is also evolving, but it's going to take more time because the clinical trials, they're related to the regulatory registration processes, and the timelines to change the processes here are even longer than the timelines to develop a new drug. Having said that, let's say even without big changes at the FDA level, there are things we have started to do and we can do. One is do trials differently, so leverage those connected technologies to have more data about the patients in real time. So we use connected blood glucose meters, for example. We use mobile technology to get feedback from patients. So this is kind of going into the labor aspect of it, so using digital to decrease labor. But the other thing, which is the other topic, which I think is even more interesting long term, is once we have solutions out there that tell us a lot about what is happening in real life, we will be able to better understand the patient needs, to really understand the healthcare professional and patient unmet needs that have to be targeted by new product developments. So the objective is to be much more relevant, much more precise, and to also have more evidence at time of launch that a particular new solution impacts positively a particular problem from a medical standpoint, also from a cost standpoint. So this real-time, this real-life knowledge about what is actually going on is something that will be brought to clinical trial design.
Rick, how do you see the regulators? I mean, you're probably dealing with regulators as well in the context of your work. How do you see regulators adapting to the fastest speed of innovation in tech? And,
I think here in the U.S. particularly, they've been supportive. I think they've been very supportive, but they have a lot to learn as well as we work our way through this process. If you think about just the connectivity piece, it started off as a class 3 medical device, and it's worked its way now down to being almost entirely declassified. And our focus is to work with industry. And by the way, I primarily talked about med device, but we work a lot with pharma as well, to help them identify the best technology to digitize their drug, digitize their device, digitize their solution, capture the data that they need from the patient, whether it's, by the way, monitoring data, vitals, or diagnostic data, or even manually generated data, and to do our best to make sure that the connectivity piece of it remains outside of the regulatory purview as much as humanly possible. And also what we attempt to do, and of course it's not always possible, but as much as possible, what we also attempt to do is a big part of the role that we play is sort of, if you will, playing a role in between the two development cycles. As you mentioned, this technology, and important to note, it's not just the technology in this device, it's the network technology as well. AT&T has already announced that their 3G network is going to be shut down by 2020. Now that won't really happen. They're just trying to motivate people to get off the network. But having that knowledge and having a real understanding of where the network technology is going, where the device technology is going, and then mediating the development cycles to attempt to future-proof decisions that are made today, because in healthcare, these devices, these solutions need to last 10, 20 years. This is never going to last 10 or 20 years.
Thank you. Well, that actually brings me to the question that we've been toying with actually for the past few minutes actually, which is around the business model and how we're going to make, how players and companies are going to make money. Now, there's a question for Pierre and Philippe. Pierre, you're the heart, and Philippe, you're investing in those companies, so you probably have a perspective on that. And so, what do you see as the as the winning business model in that space, and who's going to pay for this in this innovation?
I think you see various approaches that are currently being implemented. So obviously you have different parties that have interest in rolling these technologies on the large scale. So pharma companies have an interest, obviously, to maximize the effectiveness of their drugs and deliver the actual value that they promise in the clinical trials in real world. So I think you'll see business models of companies working directly with pharma for that particular goal, but you see also an increasing interest from the payer space. Obviously, if you better manage some chronic disease, for instance, the maximum effect will be on the healthcare spending. For instance, we talked about remote monitoring technologies. At the end of the day, if we have a more continuous monitoring of patients, it is to be more responsive, to have more preventative care than reactive care. So it's to be able to detect exacerbations of specific disease before they actually prompt for hospitalization. So if you can avoid, for instance, hospitalization costs before, by adjusting a treatment early on, for instance, this is going to save a lot of costs to the healthcare system. So we see increasing investments made by payer organizations. And I think that we are really in very good areas of new type of collaborations. I think payers traditionally have been, not in a very constructive mode with pharma, for instance, for negotiation reasons. But here you have new ground for maybe a new type of partnerships, and we've seen, a rise of, for instance, outcomes-based contracting. So where payers increasingly demand to, some actual, agreement on the performance in real world of the drugs. So right now it's we see early forms of that, but I'm pretty convinced that in the future, digital technologies will play a role as an enabler of this innovative contracting between pharmas and payers. In other areas, you see innovative companies targeting also hospitals and so on. So payers are of various forms, or some are more integrated than others. We see a lot of change happening in the US right now. I think you see more and more care services paid on value. This has started, on the physician side, for instance. You see more and more actual procedures paid on based on the success, and I think Medicare is driving a lot of change in that direction, and I think that healthcare products are going to follow this trend, and increasingly there will be part of a performance type of reward for those that actually deliver the value in real world. So we'll see probably some kind of new arrangements, but a real focus on the performance side, I think, with more than let's say pay-per-use type of schemes, rather than paying a very expensive healthcare product from the very end. You're going to have more of things that you see actually in other industries, but mostly pay-per-use, but also pay as a part of the remuneration linked to the actual value delivered.
So Philippe, you're investing in multiple companies. When you look at business models, do you prefer actually companies betting on the payers paying for things, pharma paying for things, the consumer paying for things? What do you do?
I think it completely depends on what type of company you're looking at for which segment. So if you look at companies that are providing solution on the infrastructure side, for example, on the decision-making side of hospitals, their standard business model of software as services are still predominant, and I think will still be the major business model for the next 10 years. So that's one side of thing. On the payer side, we're starting to see variation around the PMPM type of business model. We're trying to engage the consumer into that type of model, but I think it's going to take time for that to evolve. And I think the places where maybe there's the most opportunity for change is really on the drug side, as we've started to talk about. The problem there is it will really have to go through change in the way the regulators think about what is a therapeutic unit and how it can be regulated, both at the FDA level and at the CMS level, and how they are thinking about the payment of that entity what the role of the payers will be there also, of course. And because if you think about the different life cycle, a drug is there for its patent life and more. As soon as you start to link it to a digital solution, you need to think through how the digital solution linked to that drug is going to evolve and how you capture progress. So you end up in a data collection mode that are pretty intense at the consumer level so that you can continue to evolve the product on an almost real-time basis. Nobody have thought through the implication of those type of change from a business model and pricing perspective. And I think that's the big, and the regulators are starting to think about that, but it's going to take a long time before we have a solution.
Yeah, we see that in different countries. I mean, it's we know how to evaluate a drug, we know how to evaluate a medical device, but we don't know really well how to evaluate, composite type of solutions. That because now you see an offer from a pharma that changes in nature, so you don't have any real good methodology there in place, I believe, to really cope for a new form of solution that. The traditional evaluation methodologies like the multi-center randomized controlled trial is excellent for drug evaluation. However, for these very new solutions that have a much shorter life cycle, and that when you start a clinical trial to evaluate such a solution, by the time you end the clinical trial, like maybe 3 years later, I mean, you have a version 4, version 5 of this same solution that is already there. So the nature of the product is changing too fast, and we need to be more responsive, I believe, and we need to have probably different types of evaluation methodologies that are more adapted to this type of innovations. And I think that we need probably to have new payment schemes that are probably linked more like risk-sharing type of agreements, where people agree on a target effectiveness from the very beginning of a new solution, and then we can see in real life what is the data. So the good thing now is that we have the data. So it is possible to implement a scheme that is based on the actual value that we deliver, because we have markers to assess that value. So this should be a good, a positive way of looking at things. It's really to see, okay, what's the actual measure of the success in the real world, and we pay out of that.
This is where medicine meets technology and starts to look a little bit more like technology by iterating. I think that's what you were describing, Pierre, which is we have the ability now, because we have the data, to continue to iterate with the end objective eventually being towards better and better outcomes. And what's really interesting to me about digitizing our health information and getting it to a place where it can be analyzed and fed back is that data itself, sorry about this, but the data itself becomes the drug. It becomes the therapy, because it informs the patient in ways that they can adjust the way that they're acting or they're not acting, and in and of itself, without the drug, can improve outcomes. And with the type of data that we're going to be generating, I mean, there's petabytes of data streaming from our bodies, right? So identifying the right bits of data and treating it and feeding it back in real time is going to both create completely different models of care, but also when it comes to business plans, we have a lot to learn. We have a lot of work to do to figure out business models, how the business models are going to work.
Let me ask you, we have a mix in the audience in our panel actually of European and US folks here. Do you see a difference between Europe and the US in terms of payer sophistication, willingness to pay, willingness to experiment in those areas?
That's for the European to comment. Well.
So we can give examples. Of,
yeah,
you can maybe talk about the US. Like I can talk about Europe a little bit. So you see a lot of interest for telehealth everywhere. I mean, in Europe, you have different ways of rolling this out. It depends really on the structure of the healthcare system. It varies a lot. So for instance, France is pretty active into the direction of creating experimental schemes for the payment of telemedicine. So when we talk about paying for these innovations, we need to have a holistic view of payment, because it's not only the product that you have to pay for. We know how to pay for a medical device. We know how to pay for a drug. I mean, this is not really the issue. The problem is that we change also the healthcare delivery setting. We implement new services. We have to see the physician's role, which is changing. The physician is going to increasingly be involved in a team care effort. You'll see new roles, for example, for telehealth nurses to come on board and take an active role in monitoring patients in between face-to-face visits. So you change the care delivery model. You have to pay for the new type of activities on the healthcare professional side. So we can't just think only with a technological lens. I mean, we need to think about how these innovations are driving change in how healthcare is delivered, and we have to pay for those different pieces together. So we're talking a lot with the French authorities, for instance, because we want to have experiments on a large scale in different regions where you have in specific therapeutic areas, which are considered as priority ones, like diabetes, chronic heart failure, respiratory care, or, for example, chronic renal insufficiency. Those are typical chronic disease where you can really bring benefits out of rolling out these technologies. And here, for the first time, you have experimental schemes where we'll have new payment models for doctors that were going to be paid by the regional payers. So it's still not yet, prime time for a large rollout at the national level, but you see here and there a lot of pilots which start to get significant scales, though, but it's going to be an iterative process. It's going to take years. You have to also change a lot, at the physician practice level, how they are going to manage their patients. So this is going to take years, but I think we see evolutions in every country. Europe is not too behind, I think, the US. However, there is a big push in the US happening right now. And obviously, the reform is there also to push in favor of change. So, but maybe you can comment on that.
Well, we all know that we're heading in that direction, but the reality is today that the hospital administrators aren't looking for reimbursement for managing patients remotely. They still get paid when patients show up in the hospital, and so until that is addressed in greater scale, it's underway, but it's going to take years. It's when we get to a point where we're at the tipping point of outcomes-based payment, then we'll see a lot more activity on the home care front, on the remote patient monitoring front. That's a lesson that we've learned. There is some reimbursement now for chronic care management, for transitions of care, post-discharge. Very little uptake on that still, because still make a whole heck of a lot more money when they show up in the hospital. But it's changing.
This being said, CMS just announced actually some episode of care pilots actually that are pretty widespread in some areas, particularly sort of knee replacement and so on and so forth. So you'll see, they're experimenting, and I think they said something like 50% of, by 2018, they expect 50% of the payments to be based on value or equivalent episodes, in a sense. So hopefully that will trigger essentially maybe a change in incentives, different stakeholder level.
Hopefully, but again, the lessons learned around timing. I'd mentioned this to you earlier, Olivier. We announced a relationship with Novartis where we've enabled their BreezeHaler with digital technology to communicate not only when the drug is being taken, but a lot of other information about how and how much and so forth. And when I went to get the press release approved within Qualcomm, I got pushback from the PR folks, and I said, why are you announcing this release? And I didn't understand the question at first. We just signed an agreement with them, and they've gone through their approval process. We're going through our approval process. Why? They said, well, it's not launching until 2019. And well, that's the nature of healthcare. And so I do believe that we're moving in the right direction. I do believe that we will hit that tipping point. I'm not so sure it's going to be in 2017 even.
Fair enough, fair enough. Before I turn to the audience, one last question, because I think it's, when you look at the investment, we just talked about the difference between Europe and the US. From a payer sophistication standpoint, from a technology standpoint, you could argue actually Europe is as advanced as the US in many ways. This being said, you see something like 40 times more investment in those areas in the US than in Europe. I think the ratio is like $4 billion over the past couple of years, actually invested in these areas in the US and about $100 million, I think, in Europe, across Europe. So Pierre, I mean, and Philippe actually, so as a VC actually, sort of, how do you see sort of what do you see such a big difference, and what drives it?
Yeah, we see really a difference in availability of funding. So I mean, the capital requirements to be a global player in these emerging fields is intense. I mean, so you have to go through a clinical evaluation of technology. You have to go through regulatory clearance. The bar is high, especially in the US also for regulatory clearance. And you have to put the commercial infrastructure in place. So all this prompts for significant, funding needs. And you're talking about raising large rounds of funding in the dozens of millions of dollars or euros. And I think the availability of funding in the US is completely different than what we see in Europe. In Europe, you have a handful of investors that are able to engage into such large rounds of funding. In the US, you have plenty of those. So it's, I think there is an effort to be done in Europe specifically to help, in these large, capital raises. And we have a lot of excellent companies in Europe, and we see a deficit, in visibility of those companies. And we are glad to have a lot of them here today. I think we have, many different players that are gathered under the umbrella of La French Tech. So we see very, very innovative companies in different fields, and they are probably not as well visible, maybe than their US counterparts. And I think part of the objectives of also La French Tech is to try to counterbalance that, to also make these innovations more visible, and so that they can also attract more funding. And if funding is in the US, primarily because of the nature of the investor landscape. Mm-hmm. So we need to help these companies attract US funding. That's, I think, a challenge that most of the companies that we see here have. There is no alternative to fuel your growth and to engage that. IPOs are possible in Europe to fuel that, but sometimes companies go public very early because it's the only way to do these large rounds of funding, because you don't have any alternative.
And by the way, we have a venture fund that we launched at the same time that we launched the business, the Qualcomm Life Fund. Mm-hmm. And our first French investment was about a year ago in Voluntis, proudly.
Oh, right. Philippe, any reaction to this? Or?
Well, I think, the US has the advantage of scale and also of multiplicity of players. So you can look at United Healthcare as one set of experiment, Kaiser as a different set, and so on. So all of them are starting or trying to figure out what the model of the future will be. So you have a large group of interested parties that are willing to try different type of solution. That doesn't mean that the majority of those solutions will survive, because it goes to another point that was made earlier. What we went through is an initial phase of excitement around healthcare IT in the US, because you had massive progress on the technology side, and you had a group of very enthusiastic entrepreneurs that decided that healthcare was the next frontier. And then we saw really a blossoming of really interesting ideas. Now we're at the stage where everybody is asking themselves, so what's the business model? And so I think we're going to go through a consolidation phase now because it is, as was said earlier, the problem with healthcare is it moves slowly, it's extremely regulated, so people that are used to 2 years life cycle are facing the reality that it's 5+ years.
Thank you. Let me turn to the audience. I think we are a small enough group. If you need a mic, let me know. But do you have any questions for the panel? Anyone wants? Sure.
Yeah, I would like to ask one question. There's a need for a lot of connectivity and interaction with devices to implement this new revolution of digitalization. How do you see some kind of standardization, some kind of standards happening in connectivity for medical devices that will allow deploying in a wider scale the solution for medical treatment?
Not very successful ones, to be quite honest. Many of you might know of the Continua Alliance that has been making some progress, but limited. And I think the industry has been slow to embrace standards in this area for reasons that go back 100 years probably. We're doing our best to break down those barriers through the connectivity platform that we're creating at Qualcomm Life. Don't mean to make this a big commercial, but that is exactly the problem we're attempting to solve. With the absence of a standard, how can we play a role in making access to that data to deliver on the business models that they're talking about simpler? And the way that we're going about it is that effectively we're building out this platform to deliver patient health information as a service. No one cares about the technology. In fact, to the extent that a patient or a caregiver thinks they're working with technology, that's problematic, probably more than anything. So we're trying to build technology that enables the very simple, almost ambient transfer of data from patients back to their caregivers. And so we started on the home side. We've acquired within the hospital. We're continuing to pursue opportunities to acquire in both those places and places in between to try and build out a connectivity platform that follows the patient wherever they go. So that was a commercial, I'm sorry, but that's what we're doing.
You're trying to elicit the response.
So the information that you're collecting and sharing is probably some of the most sensitive patient care information that's out there. So I'm wondering what you do when you're thinking about protecting the security of your information, because we've seen all kinds of episodes of people hacking into systems, networks. Does this worry you? Do you lose sleep at night when you think about healthcare information and the way it's being transmitted?
I think cybersecurity is becoming a key issue. I think you see new also task forces implemented by the FDA, for instance, and I think you see more new threats that you didn't see 10 years ago. I think when you look at data breaches, I mean, every week you see events in healthcare, in hospitals, where our payer organizations, where you have massive amounts of data that are made public. So this is very concerning to most players. So it's pretty new to the industry because we talked about the life cycle of these products. So an example, for instance, insulin pumps. I mean, they have some insulin pumps that you have today have technology that was designed 15 years ago, maybe. And this design was not taking into account these new threats. So this poses a key challenge for most players in the industry, being them from the medtech space or other in digital technologies. So yes, this is a very hot topic right now, and I mean it's a never-ending story, obviously, because you need really to keep your systems afloat. Regulators are trying to implement high standards. I can tell you that, for example, in France, for instance, the hosting of medical data has to be accredited by the French Ministry of Health, and it's a very complicated process. It's probably one of the most stringent processes in the world for that. So regulators are taking actions to try to protect as far as they can personal health information, but it's a never-ending battle, and you constantly see new threats happening, but we need to keep up with our system as far as we can, and obviously this is extremely important in healthcare.
Yes, I do worry a lot about that, and we've been at the business of machine-to-machine connectivity and capturing data from devices that are connected to the carrier network for 30 years. Actually, Qualcomm's first business before the founding team invented CDMA and pursued that opportunity that worked out pretty well. But before that, we had a truck tracking business by the name of OmniTrax, and we deployed these transmitters in trucks, and back then we would use the satellite network because the cellular network didn't exist yet, and we would track the performance of the trucks and the drivers and feed that information back to the owners of the fleets so that they can optimize their fleets. Well, we evolved that, and we performed those types of services in a number of different industries, including in financial services. So we've developed, I think, pretty hardened, pretty secure infrastructure. But as you've heard before, you're only as good as the weakest link in the whole loop. And when you think about healthcare, you think about patients with devices streaming to the network sending data into whatever system of record it ultimately needs to go into. There's a lot of links there. There are a number of gaps, and it's virtually impossible in the world that we operate in today to control everything from end to end. So we spend a lot of time thinking about that. One other thing I'll mention, a little bit of a commercial again about Qualcomm, sorry, but Qualcomm has a group called, it used to be called QGov. They did, actually what they exactly do, I don't know, because they won't tell us. It's top security stuff, but it's secure communications for governments around the world. And they recently moved themselves out of doing just work for the government, and they're now called our cybersecurity group. And we've been teaming from the very beginning with that group as well to secure data at the device level in the hardware. But again, I don't manufacture every device that's used for monitoring patients or diagnosing patients. So still a number of weak links, and it's a problem that we have to be very, very mindful of, all of us, as we develop digital technologies in healthcare. I hope it'll be, no, I don't know. I hope it'll be more around sharing information. I think it'll be, I mean, how do you have meaningful use without being able to, when data is locked down in silos the way it still is. I mean, that was part of meaningful use. It was intended to be part of meaningful use, but it certainly has not yet materialized. So, and I would hope it would include also a patient or consumer's right to that data. But otherwise, I don't know.
Other questions?
One last one. If I'm developing a drug, I know who the investors are. If I'm developing a device, I know who the investors are. But if I'm sitting at the intersection between devices and drugs and changing the care paradigm, it is very difficult to identify who those investors are. Can you give us some advice on where this is headed from the investment community?
What do you mean by device?
Software, for instance, that helps change the care paradigm.
I think a whole series of the venture firms that do drug type of investment also do those type of investments in the US. So if you go, you know, I can rattle a whole list of names. They all will look at those things.
Okay, so it seems that there is an opportunity to find investors at the intersection of the two.
Yeah.
It's you know.
And we're seeing more and more of the bigger, well-known investors taking interest in the space, but you know, it's still the Wild West, and it's still very, very early. So it's you know, certainly not as easy to find an investor in this space as it would be in pure tech, by any stretch of the imagination.
Marrying software with drugs to re-engineer the management of one of the largest problems around the world, which is anxiety disorders and the use of benzodiazepines. And it's been very difficult to find investors, and it's going down a completely untraditional path because of the inability to find the right types of investors.
Yeah, strategics might be your best bet there. Other pharmaceutical companies and yeah.
Or maybe you can send it to
Passing
Philippe.
of the
Yeah,
buck.
Exactly. Send it to New Leaf, and then we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, but you also have reports about digital health funding done by good organizations. I mean, like Startup Health or Rock Health. And every quarter or semester, they publish the list of key investments in digital health. So they typically made public the names of the investors that participated to those rounds. So it's probably a good spot to look at if you want to see who is active. I think they even rank the funds by the number of investments they make in the sector. So you can easily find the ones that are very active. And some of them also label some of their teams as information convergence. Or if you look at the convergence theme, you have probably good chances of finding good investors interested in the space.
We also
the challenge around those type of opportunities is the obvious one. It's what's the business model, what is the scale of the opportunity, and so on. And so because there are a series of companies that are dealing with diabetic drugs and diabetes software, for example, such as Voluntis. There's the same type of thing happening a bit in the cardiovascular field and so on. On the CNS side of things, there are companies that are addressing mental health problem through a digital platform with some overlay with drug. But the question, what people are really looking for is what is the scale of the opportunity, what is the breadth, what is the quality of the management team, the pretty standard questions.
A comment on strategics also is obviously top of mind. You have like the pharma or medtech firms that typically have an investment arm. However, in the US, you have also payer organizations. They have their venture funds, and some companies active in digital health get such funding. And I think the payers are really looking at these opportunities as key enhancer of their value proposition, also in terms of services in the years to come. So that's another area to look at.
We recently created a fund as well with Novartis called the DRX. It's actually called DRX Capital, where we're investing at the intersection of medicines and digital. So there's a specific answer. We'd be happy to talk to you.
Last question, I guess, for the audience. Please, yes.
My question is related to the actual care provider position. We talk a lot about, and I agree, on the data exchange and interoperability and the benefit to consumers, but equally as much for the physicians, the people, and other care providers delivering care. How do we think about the evolution of them into the voice of innovation and change in healthcare, and how do we do that appropriately? Because to some respect, they've been on the sidelines today, thankfully taking care of us.
That's a very big question, because it really asks the question of what is going to be the role of the physician and other medical practitioner in a system.
What is it going to be? What should it be? What would you, from your vantage point, your touch points with innovation within healthcare, where it's clearly at an intersection between multiple industries now?
Yeah.
You have meaningful use changes that are shifting the complete landscape of what technology in healthcare was or will be. And you guys are on the forefront of thinking about device connectivity, wearables, Internet of Things, all of those things. I think it's a fascinating question to ask. As much as the consumerism movement is moving, how do we connect the doctor with the patient equally as much as the technology front? And how do we bring them to the forefront of innovation in addition to what other fronts?
How do we bring the physician to the forefront of innovation?
What role should they play?
Well, what's interesting to think about it this way is the way, and I'm a physician by training, but it was a while ago. The way medicine is still taught is the same way it was taught at the end of the 19th century. It's the only knowledge-based industry that is still based on memory, on human memory as the major tool for making decisions. It doesn't make any sense, given the amount of information that is generated every day in the medical field. Lawyers use search engine to find precedent and so on. Physicians should be working with decision support tool to get to the best decision on the most timely basis. It also means, but to get to that type of outcome, you need to change the way the academic system is built. You need to change the way physicians are being educated, where they are trained, when they are trained, and so on. That is going to take 20 years to rebuild the whole academic system. So you're asking a very big question, but it's not one that has an easy answer.
François, you want to react to this as well? We talked
Right. No. So in addition to the education piece, it has to work, in their workflow and also for their financials. And as was mentioned earlier, right now the system doesn't pay for performance really. I mean, there are some elements that are coming, but for practitioners, it's still more practical to have patients come in to their clinic or their hospital or their office, just get paid for that. That is not what is going to drive the adoption of innovation. So the role will have to change more toward managing a population of patients as opposed to managing every single patient, understanding which are the patients that deserve more help at what time, so optimizing the use of resources. To me, what is also kind of behind the scene, and we didn't talk too much about it, but it's the burden of the chronic diseases that we have in society is just huge, and the costs are just not sustainable. So there is a technology push we have talked a lot about, but there's also the healthcare policy and cost aspect that is going to be a major driving force for the change to happen. So I'm actually quite optimistic that the change will happen. That's right.
Yeah, very difficult to disrupt yourself. Very difficult to be interested in being disrupted by someone else. And so the truth of the matter, I think, is that doctors are going to come along kicking and screaming initially, but and I don't think you can find 1 out of 10 doctors, maybe 1 out of 100 that are saying, if I just had some digital technology, things would be so much better. I'd be able to treat my patients so much better. So again, I think it is to a degree going to be imposed upon doctors, but for the good, and there'll be a tipping point where they begin to embrace it and begin to have time to care for a lot more patients and care in a much better way for their patients. So, but it's going to take a while, and it's not going to be easy.
All right, we're getting to the end of our panel. Before we part, I wanted to ask the same question to each of you, and the question is, based on everything we discussed, what's your wish for the future? So, Rick, you want to start?
Well, my wish for the future is we can figure out all these payment models and figure out how we can build real businesses. But the real wish is when digital health becomes just part of healthcare. We don't think of it as digital health. It's just health.
Yeah, so to me it's really building on that. So when digital health becomes part of healthcare, I also wish that it does really have a strong impact, a big impact on the outcomes, on the cost that society has to bear for those diseases. It's a promise that we have today. We know it's broken today. We think that with data, with decision support system, etc., it can be better. That still has to be shown in real life, and that's my wish.
Philippe?
Perhaps two wish. The first one is to have regulatory authorities that are creative and motivated by speed. And the second one is to have an engaged consumer, because you need really those two poles to work well and fast for the system to have a chance of changing.
Yeah.
Very practical wish. I think I was very pleased with this meeting today. So I think that my wish would be to continue this on a yearly basis. And I hope we can have an annual French Tech event during the JP Morgan conference, and we can talk about interesting things, different things in the future. And hopefully we'll be able to meet again in a year from now and talk about other fields of innovation in healthcare. And I wanted also to thank all of you who attended this discussion. And I think we want to extend the French Tech into healthcare, and I think it's a good starting point. I'd be pleased to continue in that direction.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And